He's not going to give up, he's not going to, I talked to her, she agrees with that. She just, you know.
Okay, being that it's 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, depending on which clock you look at. I'll bring this meeting to order of the Finance Committee, March 20th, 2023. I'd like to get an approval of the February 21st minutes.
Melanie, since we didn't have the minutes
Second.
posted with,
okay.
with the agenda, I think we need to hold off until we
Okay,
can
never
actually
mind. No
get these
meeting
out there.
minutes.
We didn't have them ready, so the agenda was out there, but the minutes were not.
Okay, next time.
So we'll approve
All right.
We'll add that to next agenda.
Okay. All righty, well, let's dive into.
Can I introduce, this
Yes.
is Jonathan Alessi. He is helping us out from the MCIU. I think I put that in the board update in terms of some help transitioning. I worked with Sandy Ledling at the IU, and we've got Jonathan on board before Dan had announced his departure. So he's going to be with us for a little bit to help through budget season here. And then there'll be an update this weekend for the board in terms of the process moving forward with the applicants and such for filling that position. But I had asked Jonathan to be here. I know Dan and Megan
Hi, Jonathan.
in
Welcome.
contact with Jonathan through Zoom and getting going, but I wanted him to get here on site and kind of get going. So
Excellent. Well, welcome. Welcome. I'm Melanie Cunningham.
Judy Higgins.
Keith McCarrick.
Yep, so this
Welcome.
comprises our Finance Committee.
Nice to meet you all, and I'm
Yeah.
sure I'll be in contact over the coming months and with the administration and the board as a whole.
Yep, we'll be here.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Sit back and enjoy. All right, well, thank you. Okay, so we'll move on to 2023-24 budget stuff and start with human resources.
All right, so just
Georgie had planned to be here, but she had to skip out for something going on.
Okay.
So we told her it was fine.
Yeah.
She's going to kind of do a high-level overview.
Okay, sounds like a plan.
She doesn't know much anyhow.
That's part of the conversation. But she had planned to be here up until this afternoon and then had it. They said, no problem.
No problem.
So just as a refresher, here's where we are in the timeline to discuss special ed pupil services and HR. And then on Thursday, we'll have the presentation at the workshop for next year, the budget overview, a projection for this year, and then, some discussion on revenue areas.
And then that was designed in planning purposes to make sure that we kept the board, a full board, updated. Now, this will be the third of 3 presentations on Monday with the students piece, as well as the Western Center people, and then this presentation.
Okay.
I don't know, I'm sure we're going to get it done in 33 minutes.
Yeah, yes, we are.
But-
We can try. We can try. It's just,
Yeah.
you have to keep it a real high level, which may not be.
I have a
overly
reputation to
beneficial.
protect here.
Here's the numbers and that's it.
Yeah, that's it. No questions allowed.
So we were going to start with HR, but since I can cover that, I'd like to just start with special ed pupil services, if we can, just to value Carol and Andrew's time. So similar process or similar presentation here as we did for facilities, IT, and transportation to show where we've been in the past, where we are currently for the current 22-23 fiscal year compared to budget, and then where we currently are looking for the 23-24 budget. So you can see that kind of a slow, relatively slow increase year over year. I'll have a better projection for this 22-23. This is the actual activity. This is not the projection. So where it's currently midway, it'll end up being a little higher, probably about double if everything is the same, consistent year, throughout the year. So this was the same sort of presentation, like I said, for the other departments. You'll see that overall, budget year to budget year, we have a slight increase. We're at $400 so odd $1,000, and a lot of times this is for placements. We have students that are constantly moving in and out of the district when it comes to outsourced or outplaced students for tuition and special ed placements. So most of these, and Carol can probably speak to this more intelligently, would be kind of non-negotiables These are the students that are, here are the placements, here's the recommendation from the department or any needs that are specifically listed out in the IEPs, where there's not a whole lot of wiggle room. You'll see that it's kind of consistent in both of these areas, these budgets, special ed pupil services as well as HR. It comes down to a lot of the budget, a big portion of it is fixed based on student needs, and there's not a whole lot of fluff or wiggle room or anything like that nature. We'll go into that a little bit more with HR, but here's the breakdown from a professional technical services. That's going to be mostly in the outsourced instruction and other services. So there's medical, OT, PT, things of that nature, as well as outsourced instruction. So it depends on who's providing the instruction as to whether or not it falls in this first grouping under professional technical services. If it's the IU, so the IU instructional services fall under that area, opposed to, you'll see this other services. This includes tuition and some of the transportation, and my mouse disappeared. So sorry. So it is kind of, it's not a real consistent approach when it comes to how PE is treating tuition versus other instruction. So there's other instructional institutions where it ends up falling into that 300 category, 300 object code, which is in this area, opposed to tuition, which is here. You can see that everywhere else in the line items from supplies, dues and fees are essentially non-existent compared to these areas. Carol, I don't know if you wanted to speak to just as far as the students who are driving some of these costs and any of the other costs that are coming through.
Yeah, sure. So if we look at it, it's probably just under 300,000 an increase for just the special ed side of it. And a lot of that, if I look at the 22-23 school year, and I think Dan mentioned it, it's not really an option or to look at things. Some of these are policy violations for students, and some of those students, so that's pupil services and special ed, because of placement. Literally in this past month, and we mentioned to Dan it's going to go up, and not from this, I included it today, like to update it, but 2 more students, and one is gen ed and one is special ed, and it's over the next year. So we don't have an option to say, to play with that. We also have, we do have a couple of students that over this school year, it was, they were move-ins and they had already been placed, which means they wouldn't have been added to the budget coming into this year. So then that would help, that would increase it as well. We do have this school year, we have 2 students, sorry, that are placed at the elementary primary level. Currently, one was a gen ed student when he was placed. It was towards the end of last school year, so he also wasn't added onto the budget under pupil services. Now his special ed is placed, and then we have 2 other students. So you're seeing the trend. We have a number of students that at the elementary level, they were general education, child find, evaluate them, they qualify, and it was looking, and they ended up being placed. And so if it was anything, at that point, like June or later, it wouldn't have been included on the budget for this year. So then we still have to pay it, but for next year, then that adds to the increase. So we have a number of students placed. We also have, at this moment, 1 student that may very likely be placed from early intervention. We had a brief, Amy Hartzell, the supervisor, had a brief transition meeting. The student hasn't been evaluated yet, but there are pretty intensive needs, so that's unclear, but that would also be a potential placement. If that student's placed, it's very likely it would be through the MCIU.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. I know that, special ed, there's nothing we can cut. That's not even a consideration. But I'm just looking over the past years. I mean, we were kind of flat for, 19, 20, 20, 21. Is that because we missed a lot because of COVID, or there were not a lot of, as many questions because people kind of held it
I
back,
don't have
you
a
think,
crystal
or-
ball, I don't have data that necessarily, but I can clearly say, since COVID, and we're now, what are we, 2 years supposedly out of it, I think this has been probably the most difficult year, believe it or not, with our students, gen ed and special ed, policy violations, placements, as well as special ed students, and child fine for some of our younger, I call them babies, but some of our younger kids, that we have to place them.
Okay.
2021, we were started virtual through January, so it would be wonderful if you were a disciplinarian during that time because there was very few people here.
Yeah, exactly, you know,
I mean, there
that's
were,
kind of what
right,
I'm
there wasn't
alluding
a lot of
to.
that, I mean.
You know, the fact that we didn't have the kids here, that we didn't have the intensive eyes on them, you know, you
Yeah.
weren't able to observe them and your staff weren't able to observe as much to give them the things that they needed. That's all.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Now, were you also, I don't know
I
where it's
do.
going, but I know we wanted to talk
It
about.
doesn't really look,
the
you know,
screener.
I'm not at $300,000 increase in pupil services, but there was an addition in pupil services that is larger than normal. So this year, as part of the comprehensive planning process, the pupil service team evaluated 26 SEL screeners, and through lots of meetings and an analysis, we are going to add an SEL screener, K to 12, and that's going to be $25,000 to $30,000 recommended addition to pupil service budget.
That's for
With-
training the people to
It's-
use the screener.
Right, and the screener itself, yep.
Okay.
Yep. So
What do
that's
you think, and the screener
It's
is?
not an actual person.
no, it's
That's what
a
I'm
digital.
Okay.
It's a screener. It's both mental health and social emotional learning.
To administer it.
Yep, so we will have to go through a series of professional development that we'll build in, but that all has to be paid for as well.
Okay.
So
Yeah. Okay.
our goal is to, at EPS, show the screener too, this year, at the end of this year, so.
Okay, good.
Which one did you select? Are you allowed to say it?
Well, our recommendation is Pearson's SEL brief, yep. So,
Okay.
but that's a big ticket normally for my department. I usually leave all the increases to Carol.
She loves to increase that.
I do actually have a question that just occurred to me. In last week's update, there was a lot of information with regards to continuing our mental health with ESSER funds through '24. Where does that fall in the budget? Would that be under contracted services? Would that be under, like, where would we find that increase?
So that's still, I'll say, relatively budget neutral. Actually, it's a slight decrease when it comes to the Lakeside counselors. That would be in this area here as far as
Okay,
professional.
yeah, that's why I was just wondering
Okay.
where it fell. 'cause-
I think it's $170,000 worth of service for the Lakeside counselors. This year it was is it the 240? So I do think that it's a decrease as far as the number of counselors. I'm taking 2 years back, aren't
It's
I?
like 400.
I'm gonna say
I'm thinking
like-
2
it's
years back. It was
80,000
240,
each.
480.
It's 80 each, yeah.
Mhm.
Okay.
So, but I just wondered where it fell on the budget, like where we would see those numbers, but you told me, good.
Yep.
That's all I needed to know.
Okay.
And then once ESSER funds are done for that, the next year, we'll have to.
Right.
Well, that's what
Yeah.
that's what that plan was in terms of
Right.
utilizing that and see what the program
Yes.
brings in.
Okay.
So that was
Makes
actually
sense.
number 4 there, the items that were there in terms of personnel with ESSER and the current funding that's for the BCBA that we couldn't fill,
Yeah.
to repurpose that and then kind of level out. That way, we're not, the cliff there for Lakeside at the elementary level would not be an issue, because it would be addressed with that current funding that's there.
Okay.
Having a school counselor and a student assistance counselor in each of the 3 buildings.
Okay.
So
All
it would be
right.
those 3 TOSA positions, help me out, the
Coordinator.
coordinator for MTSS, the college and career, and then the,
Mental health.
thank you, mental health piece, would be the ones that we would evaluate with the last year of ESSER funds, which ended September of '24.
Right.
Still trying to be budget neutral, like, I mean, that's, trying
So
to
fund some
make sure,
money.
you know, that it was there, but yes, we're utilizing those funds, but not new dollars to the till here. Trust me, if I ask the question, I'll get that new dollars pretty quick from a lot of people.
Yeah, I can
So,
understand
but
that.
that's, I mean, you know, that's okay.
Okay. Alright.
Did you want to, I don't know if there's anything else.
I mean, that's pretty much what I was going to say. I wanted to make sure that we put it on the table in terms of discussing that and put it out for the board in terms of those, you know, utilizing those 3 TOSA positions, each on special assignment for those 3 positions, and then repurposing the dollars that are currently in there, and they gave the rationale, so
Okay.
that was what I was going to share.
Gotcha. Just didn't want to go back to HR without, we're pretty much on that topic of staffing.
Yeah.
And I'm going to jump back into HR. It's pretty much the same view here as far as following the trend. And we do actually currently have a budget decrease from the current year, 22-23 revised budget, to the 23-24. So it's good to see the decrease. The major drivers here are not, Georgie going out and spending a bunch of money from the HR side. I mean, sure, there's advertising and there's job postings and there's recruiting and job fairs and things like that, which are all relatively flat. The major driver here is the subservice that we use. So ESS, formerly Source for Teachers, is the subservice that we utilize, and they make up a big portion of our spend here. Currently, I think we're roughly about 300,000 on a year. Well, that was when I ran this, so that was a month ago. So this is a little dated as far as the total dollars. Anticipating a spend in subservices of about 850,000 at the end of the year, and that is a matter of ESS. Delta T used to be Humanitas. There used to be other services that were providing subs. The big one is ESS, both providing subs from our professional staff as well as support staff. So as I said, George is not out spending $1 bazillion in all these other areas. The major driver is subs and subservice. You can see this is pretty much driving the difference here between last year and the current year and next year's budget. Pretty much is all sitting in that contracted service for substitutes. Again, it's similar to special ed, where there's some of this stuff is essentially non-negotiable in the sense that if we need subs and we have shortages, and Georgie's out there filling those and I think the fill rate is somewhere in the 90% area. I mean, she's all over it as far as getting people in the door. That's the major driver. Just anticipating that being so well. Maybe probably over budgeted this given year. I don't think it's a matter of needing less subs for next year. I think it was a matter of, as we look back at the amount that we had budgeted for subs, it was about $960,000, which it doesn't appear that we're going to hit. When we're trending it out from prior years to this year, and for the budgeting purposes, everything kind of said you're going to need this $960,000, and at this point it doesn't appear that we're going to be quite there. So like I said, it's about that $850,000. So we're trying to pare that back to something that we think is going to be a little more realistic for the 23-24 school year.
That's good. That's very good. Any questions about that? No, that's a good thing. Thank you.
Sure.
So as we're finishing up that 23-24, I want to just kind of ask a general question so we know what information is going to be shared on Thursday. I haven't heard a number of where we kind of are ballpark because we haven't really to know what that number is, really how to crank down. Right now, you're seeing just asks and planning, that type of thing. So I'm not sure if we're going to know tonight, or if there's something that's in the presentation on Thursday. No matter what is there is what potentially is going to get put in the paper. I'm not sure if we're comfortable with that until we know what that is, or are we waiting to the next finance meeting to really dig into that? So I just ask more strategic. We're going to see an overview. You're going to potentially probably ask, I know Judy's going to ask, what's the surplus coming into the current year? And I just want to make sure that we know what it is so that we can plan accordingly. Because I know that we're going to have to go, that's why I joked with Carol, just because we got through this part doesn't mean it's all right there.
Right.
We've got to go through it and make sure that we can be in that spot for the tax increase. And we already know, and I don't know if we've seen the impact of the teacher's contract yet, in there yet.
So that's, I would have liked to have had a number as far as, you know, for the committee tonight to say, here's where we are, here's revenue, here's expenditures, and here's what we're going to need to make up, you know, any of the difference if there is. I don't have that for this evening, so to Alan's point, I don't want it to be the first time that the committee is seeing that come Thursday. So for Thursday's overview, I'll address Judy's question of where we're projecting for this year, as well as some of where we currently stand in the process and where we're reviewing. But I don't want to go through that with the board as a whole without having already come here and said, here's where we look, or revenues, expenditures, and we need
Here's your
X
gap.
percent to make up the difference. So the anticipation is not to have that conversation on Thursday, rather have that with the board or the committee separately. Ideally, I would have that tonight, but based on, you know, where we are with negotiations, I don't have everything built in for those additional dollars yet. I mean, that in and of itself, I meant to look this up, but it's probably, I think it could be about 2.5% to make up essentially where we're going from last year's figures being the salary, this year's plus next year's. 2.5 is probably on the low end of that, but I'll have a better number as we kind of move forward.
Okay.
So that April meeting is the 17th? Is that what's on the, can you go back to that?
Yep.
Yeah, April
Yeah, it was the
17th is currently listed as our next meeting.
Yeah. Yeah, it's at the bottom of our agenda.
Right.
So by then, hopefully, we'll have that, okay, here's
Here's what we
a
need.
decent preliminary number. This is what we're looking like we're going to need.
Yeah.
But we can always play with that. And we'll have that probably on April 17th.
Yeah.
That works for me.
Yeah, I think that would be.
It's
fine.
short term to May 11th when we need the board to adopt something. I mean, that's
Right.
work on admin side. But we did move, as you can see there, the meeting up from what would be most likely May 15th up before we did last year. So that way, the second final meeting in May meeting is the same week as that, if there was, last touches.
Okay.
There's a workshop in between there, right?
Yeah. Yeah, the end of April.
There should be.
Yeah.
April workshop, yeah, that would be the April workshop, 27th.
So if we saw those numbers on the 17th, theoretically, maybe at the workshop, we'd be able to have a little bit of discussion with the entire board.
Yeah.
That way it's prior to the 11th.
Because that would be the 27th
27.
is the workshop. So that gives you 10 days from the finance committee meeting to the workshop.
Yeah, that's EPS.
Yeah, that makes sense. That should be plenty of time.
Does that sound good?
That sound right? Having
Yeah.
us something preliminary
something
as far as
for-
what a tax increase is gonna look like
Yep.
so far.
For the workshop on the
Paperwork.
27th of April for the whole board?
But that may change from what we get coming in this meeting on the 17th.
Right.
If we've got we'll be tasked with driving the expenditure side down.
Right.
That's short turnaround, but we can do it. I mean, we'll do our best to. Also, in that timeframe, even though it looks like it's far away, there's the spring break is in there as well, so there's some downtime. That's 7, 8, 9.
Okay.
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 I just want to make sure we knew what Thursday looked like, so we're just trying to do an overview, and not really giving out a percent, even though that may be a question, where we have a target date of the 17th, right?
Yep.
But we can probably work.
I'm sure if you're just honest when you say, you know, we don't have those percentages to give.
Right,
forward.
right, yeah, I mean, I agree with Dan, I didn't want that to be the day that the committee's all of a sudden, wow, that's a number, I never saw that. I mean, that's the last thing I want to do.
Well, I think there's really only one person that will probably ask for the percentage at
That's
this point, so
Yeah,
maybe two.
yeah,
But-
That's fine.
So,
well, that's fine. I mean, it's early enough, yeah. It's early March, so
exactly.
Yeah.
there's time.
Tell them they can join us on the 17th if
That's right.
they're
Really
really
go ahead.
anxious.
I got you, I agree, yep, yep.
Good.
Dana's the only inquisitive one.
That's, yep, thanks, Dana.
Yes.
Okay,
Thank you.
all right. Marching orders, they're always a good thing.
So then, wanted to provide an update on the 21-22 audit. So this would have been for the year that ended in June 30 of '22. So I can have Bo and Hank from Gorman come in and do their full review of the audit. But I wanted to put this out there to the committee prior to scheduling with them and trying to fit something into their schedule. So after we go through this, if the committee would like to entertain having Bo and Hank come in, I'm more than happy to set that up. We don't have the hard copy audits yet. We sent the information back, the MD&A portion that has to go back, and that becomes part of the overall audit booklet. But as soon as we get it, I'll be sure to
Please,
give the committee
we're waiting, there's worms on our tongue.
I figured.
I know.
So just to review here, and this is always kind of the driving question of, where did we end up? And if we're looking here in this column here for general fund, the excess of revenues over expenditures is the $737,000. So that is essentially what we brought in more revenue than expenditures, $737,000 amount. What that yields in the net change in fund balance is really this $963,000. You'll see this other financing sources. So if you'll remember, we did have a capital transfer, this $13,000 amount. But in addition to that outflow of funds, we have this inflow of proceeds from leases and extended term financing. This came about due to changes on how leases are accounted for in governmental entities. So a portion of this is the fair value of our future leases. I mean, there's more of a bookkeeping aspect of it than actual dollars basically coming into the district, but this is how it's required to be presented from a GASB standpoint. So overall, the net change in fund balance is this $963,000, and so we have an ending fund balance that's $18,902,000. So here's it presented, here's fund balance presented differently. So this is the balance sheet of the district, assets and liabilities, and then the fund balance. So you'll see, my cursor keeps disappearing, overall fund balance. So non-spendable and restricted fund balance are essentially items that are already spoken for. We've already spent the funds, but they're not out the door yet, and so they're restricted. We can't do anything with them. We can't touch them. The committed fund balance, those are amounts that the board has set aside for PCERS and medical expenses. And then we've got committed or assigned and unassigned. So once we get the final booklets, these are going to look a little bit different. So what we need to provide to the auditors during the entire process is basically the breakdown between assigned and unassigned fund balances. And as you know, unassigned fund balance can only make up, can only be 8% of the overall expenditures of the district. So the numbers that we put back to Hank and Bo at Gorman were different than these. These were their preliminary figures as far as where we stand when they were doing the audit. But we went back and had suggested or requested that they put other dollars aside in the assigned for this current year's expected deficiency. So, as we came into this year, we were expecting to need to use 3.4 million in fund balance. So that is listed in the assigned, as well as another amount that we'll discuss in just a little bit as far as a fund transfer.
So Dan, on the previous
Yep.
slide, we said we were using 3.5 million in fund balance. We came in with 737,000, so we didn't touch any of the fund balance.
Correct.
We plugged the hole for the time being, we never touched it,
Mhm.
and still have 737,000.
Yep.
Yeah,
So it's basically, we're 4.2 million
yes.
under, I got
Yep.
you, okay.
So, in full transparency, when it comes down to budget to actual differences, this is another page that will end up being in the budget, or in the financials, and it's one that we look to see where we actually landed. So you'll see, on the revenue side, we brought in $2.1 million in additional revenue than we had budgeted.
And that was from, I mean, 2 million's a lot of money. Where did that extra 2
So
million?
the primary.
Great aunt die or something, or?
No, unfortunately, no. Unfortunately, no. The major part is from local sources, and so that is a combination of interest income, it could be local taxes when we're talking about local real estate taxes, earned income tax. So we have a history of, I guess, underestimating what we would anticipate on the earned income tax and even the real estate side when it comes down to collection percentages and earnings. We can provide, and we can get a more detailed breakdown of where that is from the local source, because you can see that is the major portion of that 2.1 million. 1.8 is essentially local.
Taxes.
A lot of it's taxes. It could be rental income. It could be anything in those particular areas. But as you can see, reasonably accurate when it comes to what we anticipate from the state revenue, and same as the federal revenue. But the local side, which is typically taxes, we've historically budgeted anticipating 96% of collection rate on real estate taxes. And in recent years, it's been a little higher. It could have been 96.5, 96.7%. We haven't adjusted that, just again, in being semi-conservative when it comes down to what the collection rate could be. That 96 has been what we've been using for quite some time.
Yeah, and every time a new house gets built, I mean, the taxes go from vacant land to something on it, and it's.
Well,
that
not
makes a
a lot
big
of building,
difference.
well, there was also the real estate sales over the
Yes.
past year.
Transfer taxes
So-
do come into this local area, so
Yep.
I'm sure if we were to look at the more detailed, local sources are 6,000 areas, so in those, there's a whole host of other
I'll make
line
sure you
items.
print that book so that Melanie can.
I'll be sure to do
research
that,
for us.
but
I'm on
to
it.
your point, transfer tax could have absolutely been
So-
another piece of that.
I guess my question is that a source of revenue that would then stay at that level?
Mhm.
Like,
No,
no.
Oh, not transfer tax. It
Not
depends on what the.
But the real
depends on
estate
what it
tax,
is.
and the change in real estate taxes, that extra money that we saw last year, we can expect to see next year.
Depending on with STEB having the decrease, that comes into play, as well as the assessed values. So we do have variances in the assessed values. Typically, the assessed values are increasing. We do have some municipalities where the assessed values have decreased. So it's not guaranteed, but
Something
with pretty good assumptions that yes, it would be built in there, and we would anticipate receiving that. But that is not just real estate income. That's, like I said, it's also earned income tax, it's interest income. So actually, when it comes to that, we'll anticipate seeing, a higher than budgeted interest income for
Because
this
interest
year,
is up.
because interest rates have
Okay.
skyrocketed compared to what they were in the past. So
Factors to it.
it definitely has,
Mhm.
definitely factors in.
Okay, thanks. Just want to make sure
Sure.
I understood it all.
Absolutely.
Yeah, just doesn't break down.
So likewise, on the expenditure side, we had budgeted 69.8 million and came in at 67.9 million. So we do have this $1.8 million difference where we came in under budget. And you'll see, we can go into even more detail. I don't have that up here per se, but the differences of where they actually came through. So from a general instruction side, we're pretty darn close. If we're discussing a $29 million budget, and we come in at 68. There's not a whole lot of wiggle room there, but we can go into more detail if the committee would like. I can pull some information and we can address it as we move forward, or when we have Bo and Hank here to kind of run through it in more detail, we can do that.
Okay, I think that would be fine. You good with that? Okay.
We can invite them to a workshop, to finance, or to a workshop, or?
I think last year we did the committee meeting.
Yeah. We can invite all the board members to the meeting.
Mhm.
We can do that.
Yep.
Yep.
All right, so that was, the change in fund balance for the general fund is that $5.6 million. As we move forward here, looking at the capital projects, so this is both the capital reserve and the capital projects, and then as a total, you'll see that we have a change in fund balance from essentially this 12.8 million down to the 7.6 million. The change is this 5.2 million. So this is all part of the Giza project. This is not all of the expenditures that relate to the Giza project. These are just what has occurred in the 21-22 fiscal year. And then this is showing the balance sheet. So again, that's essentially the P&L from one perspective, and then the balance sheet for both capital reserve, capital projects, and then as the total, the combined amount between capital reserve and capital projects funds. That was as of 6/30 of '22.
Okay.
This may look familiar, as it was just on the most recent board report. As far as the cash amount that is in the current capital reserve and capital projects funds, it's not really this 7.6 million. We're currently sitting on about 5.3 million. So I just wanted to point out that it's still lower than it was back in June, and that was still continuing down the other invoices, outstanding invoices for the Giza project. So given the fact that we've greatly depleted the capital reserve fund, we've been using that for good purposes. We've gone through the Giza project. Again, it's been a massive undertaking, and we were able to pay for that in cash rather than borrowing like is normal during a Giza project. Usually you go out, you're borrowing, say we're borrowing the $9 million, and then we're hoping, essentially guaranteed, to recoup those costs over the life of those improvements. We were able to pay for it in cash. We didn't have to incur all of those borrowing expenses, the interest that would be related to the bonds. And as you can see, where we currently stand with our fund balance in the general fund, I wanted to bring to the committee a proposal to have a capital transfer from general fund to the capital reserve, and then this would essentially, of $5 million, this would essentially put us in a good spot to fund a good portion of these feasibility study items that we know are coming, and it would be to set us up for being able to address those without having to borrow. Again, we're not unable to borrow, but essentially we
But
probably
we're not.
shouldn't go out to
But we're
borrow
not.
We don't want to.
until,
We're not borrowing.
until at least, 2027. The idea here is to, and we're working with KCBA to come up with that, what that 10-year plan would be as far as refresh. But essentially, rather than having to build that into the operating budget, would be set this aside. We could say, okay, from a facility standpoint, Doug, here we are, we have roughly $10 million. And then we can look at the next 10 years and go, okay, what are we going to be able to do each year with, if you were to say $1 million a year? At the same time, it should be more than $1 million, because we're going to, if you say it's $1 million, we spend, 10 million in 10 years, well, we're back in the same spot. We're going to sit here and we're going to have $300,000 left in capital reserve. So it would be a matter of funding these facility upgrades as they are, listed out on the feasibility study. And then also, I'm proposing a commitment of the general fund balance of $500,000 for technology upgrades and replacement. As we went through the IT budget at the last meeting, we discussed kind of the ebbs and flows of some of the IT needs when it comes down to replacement of items. So as Mr. Roth went through, when we transitioned from lease to buy, it's not as smooth as it is when you are discussing a lease. So you just sit there and go, okay, well, we have lease payments and we're going to pay $100,000 a year for the rest of time, or slightly increase as over time. But with having the purchase option, we do have this kind of ebb and flow of, there may be years where we don't need to purchase, or we need to purchase very few items. And so Mr. Roth's budget is going to essentially hit a trough. And at some point, we're going to hit another peak where we need to replace a certain number of student laptops, teacher computers, other infrastructure items. And so rather than have to come back to the board and the board as a whole and say, Jim's budget is up by $800,000, what are we going to do? This $500,000 could be set aside. It would still essentially sit here in this committed fund balance of general fund to address any of those ongoing items that would come up that were, I'll say, semi-unforeseen or unable to be budgeted for without having some drastic either tax increase or cuts elsewhere to try and fund those. And it could be a matter of whether that's in 1 year, whether that's in 7 years. That could
Sort of
hit-
like the turf fields.
It could hit at a very poor time where we need those tax increases to fund other expenditures.
It's because we can't pull it out of the capital reserves, because it's not a capital improvement project.
Right.
We've discussed this other years also, yeah.
Yep.
So
Okay.
we're looking at $5.5 million transfer total.
So the 500 would be an actual transfer from general fund to capital. The 500,000 is just a commitment from the board to set those aside in fund balance, but that still remains in the general fund.
Right.
So,
Okay.
Because if we put it in capital, then we
Yeah,
can't spend it.
it's already there, yep.
Makes sense.
yeah, so it can't go into capital because otherwise then it can't be used for technology, but the board can say, we're going to need this, we're going to set it aside in case we need to use these funds for IT purposes
Okay.
for
Makes sense to
future
me.
years.
Nice to be a little bit ahead on something.
Yeah.
That'd be nice.
So if the committee is comfortable with it and would like, we can then have these added as motions for an upcoming meeting. That way the entire board can have it and they can vote on it. we
And
can-
that keeps us under the 8% as well?
It will.
Yeah, obviously, yeah.
Sounds good to me.
Sounds good to you?
I'm good.
Okay, yep.
And not that I need to sell it anymore, but we didn't have the level of capital transfer last year. Like I said, we saw that $13,000 transfer, which was solely for turf. So this is essentially hitting 2 years' worth of capital transfers. We hadn't had one in the prior year.
Gotcha.
Does this have to go on the agenda for approval?
It will. I mean, I don't know that it needs to, we need to jump on the
Yeah. I
Why
mean,
don't we do it for, not this one, but
Do
the
it for the
next
board.
one?
prefer to do that in
way-
action meeting as opposed
That way
to.
everybody's had at least a bit of the budget presentation.
Agreed.
Not a problem.
Yeah, so we'll look at that for the April 11th or whatever.
27th? No, the first one.
April 13th is the.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, 13 and 14 is 27. Got it. Okay.
And now switching gears, go to Governor Shapiro's budget proposal. I will say this is just the proposal that was put out there. And as you can see down at the very bottom, it still needs to go through the General Assembly, it still needs to be voted on, but you want to go through this. I don't particularly want to read everything to you, so I will just leave it up here for a minute. But the main overviews are that the proposal includes, I think it's about a 7.8 million, or 7.8% increase in the basic ed funding, and then also another increase in the special ed funding. Those are big pieces, and then there's also mental health supports, another piece of that, which again is more spending for Andrea.
I see the word grants.
More grant.
Yeah.
I know,
More-
two lines.
more tracking. So there's definitely more money proposed to be put through the funding formula and been put through for basic ed and special ed. As well as then you'll see down at the bottom here, the proposal for this $2,500 tax credit for
So can I
certain.
move to New Jersey and then move back and get that?
Quit, and then.
I'm not providing tax advice,
Yeah.
so I don't want to go down that path.
Only nurses who get a new license.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
The other one that's out here, and just to point out, would be this, the dollars that are set aside
That's
here for
great.
universal free breakfast. I'm not sure where that's going to go. I'm not sure what the priorities are of each of these line items and
Right.
what's going to be on the chopping block and what's not. So we'll
Yeah.
kind of have to wait and see. As it relates to Upper Perk, we're looking at, so currently, here's our 22-23 allocation, and then the 23-24 increase. So these are the dollars that are currently put in there with that 7.8% increase. It's not, unfortunately, it's not 7.8% to us. It's actually more like 7.1, but the special ed increase is more like this 9.2%. So essentially, if everything were to remain the same, per the proposal, it passes with no cuts to it, no other questions, we'd be looking at another $684,000 of basic ed subsidy and $196,000 of special ed subsidy. Andrea's looking at me weird, so I'm not sure what
Yeah. So we won't hold our breath, is what you're trying to tell us?
I'm just
It
going
would
to
be
be
nice.
cautious of where this is actually going to land. So I just want to put this out there again in red. They look great, numbers look great, but can't count on them until it's passed.
Which will be
Which would be,
on ours.
it'd be nice if it's done prior to our budget, but
But it won't be.
it probably won't be. So when it comes down to it, we'll be tweaking these line items, essentially, the basic ed subsidy and the special ed subsidy. There's times where the general consensus is we're going to see a certain dollar amount and we should budget for it accordingly. There are other times where, as a group, as either through the IU or through other business managers or through PASBO, we have those discussions to say, what is the likelihood of seeing some of these increases come to fruition? And that kind of drives where we end up budgeting. If it's, a giant question mark, we may take the conservative approach and say, we're going to budget basically at the 22-23 rate because we can't guarantee it, but time will tell as we get closer, where everybody's feeling. And we get some input from PASBO, they have, and even the IU. They kind of have their ears to the grindstone when it comes down to, what they think and what they're hearing essentially is going to pass and what's going to be a holdup. So,
Just ask Tina, she'll be able to tell
Yeah.
you. She
Essentially.
knows everything.
She gets it.
Tomorrow
Yeah.
afternoon from 1 to 4, there's a seminar. I put it out to some of the admins that were able to, I signed up for it, but it's PASBO's seminar. I'm looking at the 72 slide deck that I think they're going over tomorrow based upon the proposed budget. I'm giggling because it looks like Tim's slide deck from the board retreat.
from our board
They look very
retreat, yeah.
similar. We had Tim in for the board
It's probably
retreat.
Tim putting it together.
Yeah, it probably is.
Yeah.
I mean, it's something obviously specific to us, but it was just, they look very similar, so. If there's a recording of that, I can share that, or I can put the slide deck in the board update as well, if there's interest. I mean, unless you just can't sleep, you're like, oh, let me go look at that slide deck again,
Now, I'm waiting for the audit for that.
That's fine, yeah.
No.
So,
In addition to the basic ed and the special ed, there's also this mental health support grant. Our allocation, so the base allocation was $100,000, and then there's another portion that was based on ADMs. So the 35,680 was the additional amount that we have assigned to us.
is that non-competitive? You don't know.
It's still part of the budget
Right, I'm saying-
proposal, so
Yeah.
I don't think it's competitive.
truthfully, oddly enough, when I looked through, and, usually we throw Bryn Athyn right out, they still had
Yeah.
$100,000 allocated to them, and I sat there and chuckled because they're.
Yeah, where they have
they
10
don't-
kids.
they don't have any kids. I mean, it's all, they don't have any schools, it's the only school district that doesn't have any schools, so the 100,000 doesn't even make sense that it would still be in there. I think it was just a matter of how the
I never see that
proposal.
superintendent job posted.
Yeah,
No.
right.
Yeah.
So,
Never see that.
it's just a matter of, I think, how the proposed budget was actually put out there, and then they just kind of $100,000 for every school district without taking into account that they
It
don't
doesn't
have,
exist.
basically doesn't.
Tim will catch that.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
And just wanted to touch on, so when it comes to property tax relief, this is an estimate. This is still based on the 22-23 because the property tax relief number is not out yet. But based on where we were for the 22-23, if everything were to remain equal, we'd be looking at estimated assessment exclusion of this $9,146, which then had the impact of a tax reduction per homestead of the 236. It's really 236 and change, just round. So that information will be coming out in May, and then we'll build that into basically into the budget, and then into the tax bills as we were calculating them.
Okay.
That was
Yeah.
the end of the update for the proposed state budget.
Thanks, Dan.
Sure.
Do we have any idea when that audit's coming yet?
You haven't
So I can
heard-
plan my
Becky,
time.
you haven't heard back yet, right? So we submitted the MD&A back to them that they need to just take in and put in. It's typically a plug and play, we can just copy and paste. We haven't heard back yet, so as soon as, like I said, as soon as they come in, I'll drive it over, I'll bring it over and drop it off.
Yay.
It's all four of them.
Yep, yay. Thank you.
Sure.
All right, do we guys have any more questions or anything you want to talk about?
Well,
All
let's
right.
just continue using those conservative estimates. I'd rather come
Yeah.
out ahead at the end of the year with
Yeah,
windfalls, we'll call them, than projecting too high,
Yeah.
coming out low.
yeah, that's pretty much how we can, you know, what we can do. And really, realistically, on what is our budget, $76 million?
74 and change.
Yeah, I
I mean,
know,
it
it's
will,
getting
I
up
mean,
there.
as we kind of tick
Getting up
forward,
there.
be close to that.
You know, that's not a terrible margin of error, considering, you know, we have kids moving in, kids moving, it's a lot of moving parts. Definitely. So can you remind me, did Doug's budget have or not have, like a placeholder for if we decide we're doing the security upgrade personnel-wise?
It did have, it was built in.
Okay, I couldn't remember. I just was thinking about that this morning, so.
Yeah, so that's the RFP.
Right.
The RFP, so that's planning on going out probably by the end of this week.
Okay,
And just to put it out there, that the RFP was for, we had done one 2 years ago, I think, for safety and security. This next one is getting ready to go out. No decisions are made yet, but it's going to go out, and it's looking for both armed and unarmed, pricing for both armed and unarmed.
okay, okay.
And I can share the RFP with the board on Friday in the update. And, but we want to get it out to the various groups that are on that PCCD site that are the contractors for that.
Okay.
And we met with Rodney as well to go over kind of a game plan in terms of putting that together. So
Okay.
that'll be out
All
there.
right, I was just thinking, I know that's a good chunk of change, so I wanted to make sure. All right,
Yeah. Now, what was in Doug's budget, remember back last time, it looked like when numbers went down, they had removed almost everything they thought would qualify for capital.
right.
I don't know if he re-leveled it or if but there was some decision that still have to be made on some of the programs that were there. So maybe that's some of the fine tuning as we get there, what's in capital and what, you know, you don't have to pay for it out of capital. It seemed the things that got pulled would qualify for
Right.
capital, but if there were
Right.
things that you can work into your regular budget, knowing they're one-time things, that's okay as well.
Okay,
So, and then Andrew did get a preview of the potential KCBA final piece. We're waiting on that 10-year
Yep.
type of projection thing. So I know that I had seen Mike last week and he had said he speak to that meeting. So
we had a
that was kind of the final
fascinating-
piece to that.
Yeah.
And really, that'll probably, once budget's over, that'll be the next thing is for us to kind of dissect that facilities or
Yep.
feasibility study and really, okay, what's realistic. Right now, it's just brain dump of ideas.
Yep,
But, you know, I know you guys, we did it for a reason, right?
yep, that was a
To at
good
least
study.
not just say, oh, yeah, we did that, you know, that definitely helps.
No, it was needed.
Helps
Set up our
student,
plans for the next
Right,
10
yeah,
years.
right.
I mean,
Exactly.
student-wise and, you know, the projections there. And then, you know, Dan kind of said, you don't want to get to the point where you're 10 years down and then you're back where you started. Unfortunately, it sounds like similar conversations we're having at the Western Center,
Yeah,
where you guys did the big upgrade for a while, blah, 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 and now,
I'm glad you brought that up because I was wondering, just something to think about is if we're putting away money for capital funds, which is capital improvements, we're going to have to ask the lawyers whether we could actually pull out of that to fund capital projects that, you know, or repair project that we had to do down there since we're doing capital.
yeah, that's a good question.
Right,
Does
because
that
you said
qualify?
that.
We should start looking at putting
We need
money
to start
away.
putting money away because we're gonna have a big kind of.
they're looking at the same
They're looking at $1 million a year.
10-year plan.
Increase. So
Yeah.
we should,
Yeah.
we need to at least factor it into our budget plan.
Yeah.
Right, I
Mhm.
agree.
There's also a lot bigger conversation with the way, whatever, again, maybe Keith, maybe when you were at Pottsville, were you a part of that team of 27 that had to decide?
I was actually on the board down there, so I was on the JOC, and then when they funded the project down there, we had to get all 3 boards together, so it was
Convention.
3 nines, 27,
Yeah, yikes.
down there for a convention. We were down there with Sandy and ARPA's administrator, Dave Nestor, people from Springford, so we had probably 50 people in there on a Saturday afternoon for 7 or 8 hours, and
That sounds awesome.
you think we have fun here?
I know.
I know what you're
Oh, my
gonna say.
God.
No, and Keith, the idea there was to fund that through the operating budget.
Oh,
Was it, I mean,
Well,
I thought that was the last conversation we had, was that it would be,
that's what people are thinking about, but we don't know whether we can actually do it or not.
Mhm.
And any projects down there are supposed to be funded through the rules of, I'm blanking on the word, but the contract that we have between the other
Articles of
two
agreement.
schools.
Articles of agreement.
Articles of agreement, yes. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I was thinking of something else which was totally inappropriate. Warfare. Engagement, articles of engagement. But, you know, the way it's based down there, it's based on property values, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, there's some
And
differences.
Springford would have been bearing the bulk of it. That's why we had that convention of 27, so that they could, so that they didn't have to absorb that cost all the time.
When we see the numbers on Thursday from the current budget, current enrollment projections and programming, and then eventually the budget from the Western Center team, you'll see us having a low of a lion's share, because that's about ADM over the last 5 years. And we've grown and have exceeded that, so. Good, bad, or different, that's just the
That's
numbers
what it
higher
is.
on our
Yeah.
side.
It's good.
Yeah, I mean, it's,
Right, I was gonna say, it's
So-
something our students are utilizing.
Right, no doubt, yeah, I mean-
Well, actually, if you're doing ongoing maintenance, that might be the proper way to do it. But if we have to do like a addition or something, that's more of a capital improvement than just the routine maintenance that we have to do for the upkeep. You know, like repairing the roof or something like that. You know,
Right.
then we should have the convention at 27 and discuss it.
And work it out.
Yeah.
I think it would come
Right now,
out.
you're not looking at that, you're just looking at some neglected maintenance, right? And
Correct.
improvements, but not like an actual addition.
Correct.
well, there's talk about how
I can see the need.
somehow
for
it went
addition.
from a 4-year program, or 3-year program to a 4-year program, and then with the introductory, now it's a full 4-year program. And, you know, every year, and Andrew knows better than I do, we get kids that don't get in. That's just not just us, it's everyone.
Yeah.
There's a limited supply of spaces because it is doing so many great things.
Yep.
So there was discussions there, hopefully they don't bring it up on Thursday, about adding 2 new programs. It was really like, it felt like it came out of left field, like, what's the process? We weren't really following a process.
Yeah. Well, actually, it used to be a full-day program down there, and then they switched to the half-day program
Right.
after they'd done the renovation down there. So that changed the dynamics again because of all your scheduling. So,
Right.
and some people still wonder whether you should go back to a full-day program or not.
Now, the full day
But-
program, they have their English and math.
It's
down.
comprehensive
yeah.
then, right?
Yes, it's
Yeah.
comprehensive then, yes. So,
That'll probably be
That's
less,
transporting.
less kids though, overall,
Yeah,
and
a lot
footprint
less.
at the time.
Yeah.
mhm, yeah. And
Or a
and that's
3-year
the trade-off there.
program too, that's a different option as well, lots of different options, so.
Yeah.
Right.
And then it's a
So
matter of which
just to-
programs you want to add in.
So just to, because I'm not sure I got the answer out of that. So if the tech center, the Western Center has to have capital improvements, can they come out of our capital improvements?
It'll,
If they really
I
are.
believe it's going
capital.
to depend on how those are funded. So essentially, if the Western Center were to borrow to fund those, the bond payments could be made out of capital
Okay.
reserve. But if it was to be absorbed in the operating budget, then the capital reserve funds would not be able to be used
Okay.
in that situation.
It would have to come out of our operating
Right.
funds. Okay.
There's current discussions down there with Mark Davis, their solicitor, about can they or can they not have a fund balance as a charter school, as a tech center. Initially, for a long time, it was no. That's why I think the articles of agreement do say they have to return the money. And then they
Right.
didn't return it for 2 years. Hopefully we'll get that at some point, around 200,000 or so coming back. But then it seemed that the wave of feedback was that you possibly could, because everyone's like, well, if you get to the end of the year and you've got $600,000 that normally goes back to the schools at the same proportion it came in,
Right,
couldn't that then go into the fund balance of some sort?
right.
At least a capital
A
reserve.
capital reserve of some
for-
sort, right, yeah, so that's being
maintenance,
discussed, it
because
wasn't
That
clear,
makes
but.
sense.
Well, it
Mm,
that
yeah.
makes
I mean, the
sense.
other
Yeah,
aspect.
But then they could argue,
Cap it
they could argue
somewhere.
that, or the money has to go in there at a certain proportion, because if it goes in at a portion because of the ADM, and that's not how it eventually will be spent, I mean, who knows?
Yeah.
For someone else to figure out.
I guess
but-
that's complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to say, the other portion of it was, and I've seen this argument elsewhere, would be those particular funds that would be refunded to the district from the operating side. Essentially, if it were to sit with the with the Western Center, then the Western Center is earning the interest, and then whether or not, who's essentially having the end-all, be-all say of how it's being used from a capital aspect, opposed to if it were to come back to the district, it could be set aside again. It could be one of those situations where it's still set aside in fund balance, again, committed for that.
And definitely one of the schools there is as the money's coming back from the last 2 years, they're putting it in a fund earmarked in their own world about Western Center. That way it's sitting there, and I mean, they would have the opportunity, they would determine how it gets dispersed or what percentage, or if they got a bill, if they, it just wasn't going back to the general fund.
Right, yeah, but it would be maintained, essentially maintaining the actual dollars at the district level opposed to at the tech school level, so.
And then however they had to pay for whatever upgrade or whatever it was, their portion would come out of that.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the under the pillow stash you have, you want to get it out of there.
Yep.
Well, it makes sense, I mean, we have to support that too.
Yeah.
Stuff it all in the mattress and pull it out when you need to.
Yep, yeah.
Just put a little post-it note.
And then
on it,
there's
this is
always the
Western
option
Center.
of, you could always withdraw from the tech center and we could create our own up here. And that would create all kinds of problems, both for us trying to figure out how to finance it and manage it here. But then that would cause a big problem with the other schools trying to divvy up what the assets were.
It'll be like kids working the screen, no one will be hurt.
The elevator.
Now somebody will listen to this tape.
Oh, yeah, it's all
It's
the,
going to be,
yeah.
Yeah.
You're gonna get a question from Bradley on it.
well, actually, that was a problem back then when we were doing the convention of 27, because that was a time when Springford was exploding and building all their elementary schools and middle school and everything. Were you
Yeah, I wasn't
back
there
there?
yet.
No, okay. And I was quoted in the paper as, by Evan Brand, I think it was, we were having a discussion about they were trying to make it a satellite school for them, essentially. They were going to send all the Springford students there and sort of push us out. And I said, well, if that's going to happen, we're just not going to fund it. And Joe Cerisi was calling me up the first thing the next morning, saying, Keith, what's going on?
Why did you say that?
So it's like, yeah, it was blown out of context.
Surprise, sure. All right, anybody have anything else? Dana, have anything? Good to go? All right, I would,
Motion to adjourn?
thank you.
I'll second that.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Well, thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Jonathan, nice to meet you again.
Thursday.
Yep, yes, yeah, no, weeks are gone. But not Monday, Mondays is not.
No, Mondays never go fast.
No, they certainly don't. Well, that's good. I thought that was gonna be a lot longer today. Said to my husband before I left, I don't know what time I'm gonna be back. We'll have to talk about it. See how the house, because we're all scheduled, talking about it. Have a good night.
Send you a copy of this,
Sure.
as far as for your records.
Yeah, I heard you got.
When's it? I can't remember.
I don't know why.
It's Wednesday.
It's Wednesday sometime.
You guys know the bridge is closed now? It
Yeah.
wasn't this morning,
I
but it
got a
is now.
text, I got a text from James.
That's still winning.
1:15?
You changed it back.
We want to turn our camera on. Yeah.
Because I think you changed it to 3:30 for all our,
I use it.
be there, so it was like 3:30 for
For our Zoom.
Yeah. Oh.
You heading down?